The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. I'm Laura Kaminsky, Associate Director of Education for the Humanities, and it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the Y for the second evening, The Shape of the City. Let me take a moment just to remind you of the format. Following the moderated conversation on stage, there will be an opportunity for you to submit questions on the index cards, which were given to you as you entered the hall. Ushers will collect them and bring them backstage for presentation. Our guest this evening is Robert Stern, principal in the firm of Robert A.M. Stern Architects of New York. Among the numerous awards which his firm has received are first place in the national competition for 1,000 units of housing on Roosevelt Island, National Honor Awards of the American Institute of Architecture, and several distinguished architecture awards of the New York chapter of the AIA. Mr. Stern is professor and director of the Temple Hoyne-Buell Center for American Architecture at Columbia University, and is the author of several books, including New Directions in American Architecture, 40 Under 40, Young Talent in Architecture, and George Howe, Toward a Modern American Architecture. His work has been exhibited at galleries, universities, and museums, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Cooper Hewitt Gallery, the Art Institute of Chicago. In 1986, Mr. Stern will host an 8-hour, 8-part documentary, Pride of Place, Building the American Dream, which will be aired on public television. Let us welcome then our moderator, New York Times architecture critic Paul Goldberger, and our guest Robert Stern. Thank you.
Country, but probably the most successful architect writer team within one man that we have produced in some years. Let's turn, as we always do at the beginning of these sessions, to just a quick run through of some slides which Bob Stern will narrate for us very briefly. We'll then raise the lights again and begin our conversation.
Thank you, Paul and Ms. Kaminsky, and for those nice introductions. Paul's description of me reminds me that we were both young in the Ice Age, but it wasn't really that long ago. I put together a selection of projects that don't go back to the Ice Age, but are relatively recent and some quite up to date. They illustrate, among other things, as the first few slides do, my interest and the interest of my office in the relationship between things that are new and things that are old, things that are modern, things that are traditional, and the fact that in our current architecture, these distinctions are not so clear as they once seemed to be. So that this entrance to a Georgian house in New Jersey is juxtaposed to a architectural aesthetic which of our own devising done about 5 or 7 years ago, but that combination of freestanding wall and passing freely past the column screen is a vocabulary that was familiar in the late 20s. It happens the Georgian house we are remodeling also was built in the late 20s, so that what was modern then is not so modern anymore. At that same house, we were asked to add a swimming pool, an indoor swimming pool, which we did a place of good time and pleasure, which we tried to make seem as it was intended. a place that brings natural forms together with the most artificial forms, man-made, and light coming through an artificially conceived environment that gives you a similar kind of juxtaposition and between what might be and what is, what you imagine and what you dream. That comes to a full culmination in the nighttime view of that swimming pool, in which light playing against the water, in which painted and real surfaces, tile, stone, and the painted versions thereof are all played together to create an environment that is theatrical, entertaining, pleasurable, and is meant to be a contrast with what I was taught was what modern architecture could be, which was extremely serious and extremely earnest about materials and about what the present, the potential for present expression was. Going back into the past, we've been able to tap the well springs of many feelings that I as an architect have and clients have about places and about the distinction between places. Many of our houses have been built along the eastern seaboard in the northern part of the country, where the colonial experience of the pre-revolutionary era married somebody's office calling, married together with the resurgence in an interest in America in the 1870s and 80s to create something Vincent Scully, Paul's teacher and mine had labeled a shingle style. I have tried to revive that shingle style, not by literally copying it, but by relearning the elements of it, because I believe they were uniquely appropriate to the place, to the climate, to the expectations that I and my clients have for a good time place by the sea. That's not to say that these places are only involved with sentiment or only about the soft times of our lives. They have within them, I believe, an earnestness and a structural organization that gives them a toughness as well. In these houses, we've taken ordinary elements like a staircase and opened them up to the rooms that they abut, just as they were done in the 1870s and 80s in the shingle style, and tried to make those staircases kind of public places within the private realm of the house, creating spatial flow between levels where it enhanced the use patterns of the house, and making the movement between floors exciting and stimulating a kind of chance encounter on the stair within the house, just as the staircases and passageways of a city also stimulate chance encounters between people. That vocabulary, which in my view resonates rather deeply in at least our New England experience, has led to work outside the private house sector in the dangerous waters of commercial development, as here in a project at the edge of a golf course. It's called St. Andrews in Westchester County, where I believe at least, that my office has achieved a marriage between the exigencies of mass-produced or relatively mass-produced housing and the needed repetitions and the sense of individuality, which is fundamental to creating a successful dwelling place. That is to say, in maybe simpler language, this vocabulary of the shingle style, looking back in time and reinterpreted by us in the present, is rich enough, complex enough, so that we can make things that are different even in a mass housing situation. There are many vocabularies available to us as architects. One of the problems of modernism was that it focused on one vocabulary, technologically derived. I prefer to look at a range of vocabularies that are culturally related and perhaps even culturally derived. This is a house more recently completed on the North Shore of Long Island, which creates a grand facade with the obvious house-like image of pitched roofs and a kind of temple front, strongly emphasized entrance, all in white painted brick, and then as the house opens up around it, erodes to simpler, less aggressive forms, softer in its materials, shingles here, courtyards that allow light to come in and focus on the local and close-in landscape of major trees, as also the distant landscape of the Oyster Bay beyond. Again, on the inside of this house, it being a year-round house and it being a response to a client's requirement for a grander and more imposing kind of environment, uses a classical vocabulary, a vocabulary that when I was in architecture school was said to be dead and part of the ice age of the 19th century. I believe that I am not alone, but perhaps have had some role in influencing a number of architects to reconsider this vocabulary, to see it both in its scholarly way and for the fresh interpretations we can produce. In any case, this house, you're looking down the long gallery, which has the entrance behind, the courtyards on the right opening to the view, and it's concluded not by a statue or a solid form, but by a glass wall which curves and leads the eye out to the landscape as it leaves the body off axis to the side. I am interested in the richness of architecture and the complications that one can achieve, but not just at the expense of the user, but growing up out of the program. This is a building that is modest in size and grand in execution and intentions. This dialogue between what things are and what things aspire to be is central, it seems to me, to American architecture and to my own work, and comes to another kind of test in the commercial sector as in an office building. An office building, to me, is a type that evolved 50 years ago or more and hasn't really changed very much. What architects are able to contribute to it, aside from the occasional technological innovation, is to create buildings that have more than just the walls around them, that respond to their site, to an image. My view of this office building outside Framingham, Massachusetts, near Boston, is of a palace of work with a grand entrance which is deliberately contrasted with the glass wall which attempts to suggest bands of masonry rustication, even though glass it was all that was affordable. Glass, just parenthetically, does not need to be reflective, as so much of our architecture has it now. It has many, many possibilities. The inside of this building creates an important interior space within the office building, a major intersection in the cross-section of a relatively small building, conforming to my view that the interior space of most of our buildings, public and private, is of paramount concern since we spend so much of our time inside our buildings. You're looking from the outside on your right through the entrance vestibule, which reiterates that kind of pedimented form at smaller scale, to the great staircases which rhetorically lead to the second floor but create an opportunity for social interaction. I'm happy to say that the people who have moved into this building, which is my first completed office building, use this space for parties. The tenants have parties to entertain their clients, but more importantly to meet each other. And in the dreary landscape of the roadside strip, where this finds itself between mobile service station, which I now know is a word from our sponsor, the paint stores, and I'm not even showing you the Red Roof Inn with its 110% occupancy rate just beyond. This is the real landscape which we find ourselves. Ours is a dignified building, but one that tries to create a dialogue with this world that so many of us who are not New Yorkers spend very much of our time in. It is, however, a building that must stand on its own as an icon, must be an advertising symbol and a work of architecture, as well as a piece of contextual reference. Lastly, I'd like to show you a building at the University of Virginia, a totally different environment in which that same theme of new and old that I began with is represented. The new being, the old rather, being a building only 10 years old, as you can see in the left and right-hand view of the slides, a kind of mindless shed of brick and pitched roofs that housed the dining hall for the freshmen at the university. We were asked to add 200 more seats to the 400, at which some 600 delectable meals are served 3 times a day. And we were told that the University of Virginia had a 125-year-old tradition of Jeffersonian architecture, which seemed to have escaped the attention of the previous architect. We tried, and I believe successfully, to recapture that, to create a glazed kind of porch-like addition on each side of the building, on the downhill side to create an arcaded loggia, which eventually will be an outdoor food service, to light each one of our bays of space independently articulated with structure, to independently articulate them with light from cupolas from above, marrying lessons from Louis Kahn, a teacher from my generation, with the lessons of classical architecture and Jefferson's own architectural language as developed on the lawn. The window wall is steel and glass. It is actually made by the same people who made the windows for the Falling Water building of Frank Lloyd Wright. The architecture is brick and wood as where appropriate, and it is an attempt to make a marriage between these two traditions and to create what I hope will not be a synthesis in the sense of a pablum, but a synthesis in the sense of an intelligent dialogue. These are, this is a view down the porch-like loggia, the enclosed part of it, that is, where people dine, the light coming from above, and the articulation of the space into comprehensive areas that encourage intimacy at the mealtime, which is sometimes the only time these students get to come together with their colleagues. At night, of course, when the moon is right and the lights and the photographer knows what he's doing, the building is also a limpid advertisement for a new administration at the university and for the architect. I suppose we should go on to discussion now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. My first temptation upon looking at those was, wouldn't it have been wonderful to have sort of mixed up the carousels and have Charles Gwathmey show us these slides and have you describe some of the buildings that he showed us last week.
Interesting. I'm not sure wonderful.
I'm struck as I think, and I don't mean to force a comparison, but it's kind of inevitable since we've just spent so much time in this same format talking with him. I'm struck by, besides the obvious more formal differences, by the fact that Charlie spoke last week very much in abstract terms about space and form and mass and volume and their essentially formal relationships to one another. You've spoken much more in terms of image, in terms of mood, in terms of sensual and emotional qualities buildings have, in terms of things that might even go under such a hated phrase as lifestyle as well, but certainly image. Is it a fair distinction to make between what you're doing and the modernist tradition, to think of one of them, the modernist tradition, as being more fundamentally cerebral and your architecture being fundamentally more emotional and sensual?
No, that's not fair. It is not a fair distinction.
Then explain why not.
I like to think that my architecture, and I'm by no means alone in this among my colleagues, although I'm not sure I would rank Charlie, who, by the way, in one of life's many fates, was a co-student of mine at architecture school. He's just a little older than I am, but we sat virtually side by side. Such is the way things go, and we are friends. I think that my architecture and what is happening now in architecture begins where modernism or functionalism leaves off. You cannot have an architecture that's just about its grammar or its syntax. I think if you go to the doctor, you're all very well interested in how he's going to do the operation, but most important, you're interested in the life and death matters of, will I be all right again, whatever. You don't go to the lawyer just to find out the fine points of law. You're interested in whether you're going to live or die at the executioner's hand. I'm not sure architecture is quite as serious as medicine or law in that sense, but I think we go to architects to solve certain problems of life. The means that the architect has, his ability to manipulate section, plan, materials, technology, the craftsman in the field, everything, you have to assume that he's in control of that. Don't go to him. You also have to assume that he knows when to let go of those things, when he doesn't have to get everything to line up, because everything lining up will be against the nature of the problem at hand. So I would like to say that any architect worth talking to is in control of the grammar, but who wants to hear about it in a public forum about other ideas?
You know, the grammar is really nothing more than a means, and
Well,
should not
it's
be seen as an end in itself.
I mean, if you want to say beautiful thoughts and you can't command the language and its grammar, then you can never have beautiful thoughts. There's no question. So it's not to demean it.
Sure.
But I'm interested in beginning the conversation where that is taken for granted, that we all can speak at least all the people on the platform can speak architecture very well. And then it's a question of what are we going to say? I think that's where I like to begin.
Is it possible sometimes that what you're trying to say, that the message overwhelms the medium, though, in a certain way, and that when the emotional impact and associations of a building are as potent and rich as some of yours are, that, if anything, they can almost become too associated with a kind of a decorative impulse, we might say? Or is that not a bad thing either?
I don't think that's a bad thing. First of all, I find that so many people see buildings casually, even private buildings like houses. People see them in 100 different ways from the way the architect or the owner of that building ever imagined. So they bring their own associations to the project. I was once standing on the beach in West Hampton looking at a small house that I'd done and admiring it, of course. And two ladies walked down the beach and they were hotly debating the house. There was no question about that. And I thought, oh, here it comes. They're going to say this is the thing that is the ultimate obscenity on the beach at West Hampton, of which there are many. And I thought, here I go, I'm in for it. And, but they came by and they were debating the roof line of this house, and they were debating whether it was Japanese or Chinese. Now, I think about the history of architecture every day, every minute, but I never think about Japanese or Chinese architecture. I know nothing about either of them. And they were arguing, and I thought, well, this is fine. I mean, they liked this house, and they said they implied they liked it through their snippets of conversation. And this had stimulated in them certain responses that I didn't understand, but once I heard what they were saying, I did understand, and that's good. I think architecture should do that to people, and you bring to architecture your own values. I only object to architecture that gives out so little to the world that it relies either on your saying, I have no values, I'll check them at the door, throw them away, or that I have to kind of imagine what this is really like. Somebody shows a big black box and says this is a palace, but it doesn't look like a palace. It just looks like a big black box. You have to imagine it's a palace. That's where and that argument part company.
Granting that the line between architecture and decoration has become blurred in the last generation, where do you think it stands now? Or should there even be a line?
First of all, I think
what is the distinction?
Architecture, in some ways, is the art of building beautifully. You can just build, and then if you build extremely well, it's architecture. And one thing you bring to architecture is culture. Another thing you do is bring to it a refinement of detail. If I were to describe the room we're in, it's just a box with windows on one side. It's got a bunch of downlights and a few pendant fixtures. Now, that doesn't describe the architecture of this room. I'd have to describe the architecture of this room. I would have to describe the articulation of a probably combined real and imagined structure on the ceiling, a pattern of windows but I can barely see above openings, and then the whole ornamental system, which I gather has been restored or certainly taken care of with great care. And that enhances the architecture. That decoration brings that architecture to life, just as all these patterns in these pendant fixtures. And the Star of David, which in turn forms a very important side of each one of those, tells you that this pendant fixture is in the YHA as opposed to the YCA. And that's okay. That's what helps you. Lets you know where you are, or who you aren't when you're sitting in this room. And it's all tied in. Take all that away, get Edison Price to put downlights in the room, paint it all white. It's not a room for me anymore. It's just the potential for a room. I'm interested in the real thing. And to me, that's the way the real thing gets done.
Okay. What about, let's face the whole issue of originality, change, continuity, all of those things that are thrown around in every which way. What is your response to the criticism that's so often heard about your work and the work of a number of like-minded architects, that it is too much like what has come before? That where is the creativity? Why does it not look like it's of our time? I pose that as the devil's advocate.
I assure you, I knew you'd do that, Paul. First of all, I don't know what the work of our time looks like, except that it's the work of our time. The zeitgeist, as it used to be affectionately called, should take care of itself. If I choose to paint the world blue, and people allow me to paint the world blue, that's the painting of our time. It is a conversation between those who let artists, and I rank myself among them, do their work, and those who do the work, and that's what the time defines. Clearly, if the time needed white painted boxes, then I would be out of work, or I'd change my aesthetic a little bit.
Well, there was a time that wanted them more than now, and indeed I recall that your first two offices were pretty white when you started in business.
Even my present office is pretty white. I don't believe in one thing.
Right.
I believe, and I don't want to sound like a chameleon, but to some extent I think I am a little responsive. I am solving physical, functional problems, but I'm also solving aesthetic, cultural problems. And there are places where I stop and will not go any further, and other places. But you asked another question which I think is appropriate for me to reply, which is the question of originality. Originality in art does not mean doing it the way nobody else had ever done it before. That's weird. And besides, awfully hard to do after 2,500 to 5,000 years of architecture. There are just so many shapes in the world that anybody's been able to figure out. Originality, in the best sense, has to do with a fresh interpretation. You do not expect each new composer to reinvent the scales. In fact, the effort to produce the 12-tone scale is a disaster.
So well. We've actually returned very emphatically to the 8-tone scale of music.
It's also perfectly possible to argue that Stravinsky is one of the most original composers of the 20th century, yet if you examine his work, he did classical symphonies, he did themes and variations on many people. It's what you do with the material. The whole world is your palette as an artist, whatever field you're endeavoring. It's what you do with it that is original or not. Copying can be literal or interpretive. And that's
I agree, and I think the best analogy is really to language. I mean, a writer does not rewrite the English language. He does not invent new words. He makes new combinations from existing words and syntax. Yet, even saying that, the house on Long Island that you showed us looks, that main facade, one does have a sense that one has seen it very clearly before, even though Lutyens didn't paint it white. I mean, the sort of central triple gable and then the larger side wings that way are, I mean, that is a particular, if we return to an analogy of music, that it is a clear quotation, if nothing else.
Well, it's not a direct quotation. A direct quotation would have been to rebuild the facade of Tigbourne Court, from which upon which it is based. That was not necessarily undesirable, just impossible. The situation that this house found itself in, with a compressed relationship to the approach, was very analogous to Tigbourne Court, which I had visited and studied it long before and since. So it made a perfectly logical situation. But then other conditions in the plan and the way things happen change it. So it is not a borrowing. Artists don't borrow. That's also a ridiculous phrase. It's based on Tigbourne Court by Lutyens, but it's now something new. new and old, familiar and different at the same time. I mean, everybody who does this and puts whatever it is, 5 columns in it, is in a way deriving from the Parthenon. Yet we know that the Parthenon itself had antecedents, and we make many interpretations, how we add to it and not. That's the individuality of art.
In the case of the Long Island house, you were going back to Lutyens and also to other classical sources. Were you also, let me rephrase the question and say that I sense in your work a sort of twin parentage, in some cases desirable to you cultural references, both all the way to classicism or to more recent imagery that might be associated with a very luxurious classical house on Long Island. In other cases, a kind of a more contextual ancestry, deriving not from image that seems desirable or has nice associations, but as in the shingle-style houses you've done on eastern Long Island, derives from the pre-existing architectural context. First, is it fair to say that your work stands on those sort of 2 legs? And second, how do you put more weight on one and more weight on the other? In which circumstances?
Well, I think that the way I approach architecture is to assess every situation on its own merits, using the principles of composition and grammar that as best I can master them, and inflecting them or modifying them at wherever appropriate. When I am confronted with a very strong context, like Eastern Long Island or New England in general, or like the University of Virginia, my instinct is to try to button onto that context. When in Rome, do as the Romans do, on the assumption that they have evolved something strong and positive. And if everybody says Jefferson is a good architect, my obligation is to find out why and how he is a good architect and try to be as good as he is. Whereas in that house on Long Island that's painted white, it's in a typical exurban community in which no dominant style existed because no culture really evolved from the period before industrialization where people had to build out of the earth, nor no genius like a Jefferson was able to control the environment, then it's my job to create something of a like-mindedness to the quality of things around it, but not like it in the exact imagery. There are houses that have grand aspirations. There are Tudor-Beathan houses. There are Georgian houses, whatever, but they have a commonality of strong entrances, distinctions between fronts and backs, usually a fair amount of classical detail, and so forth. So that was the jumping off point. It's to build something that you expect, but to build it better than in these parlous times most people ever imagined could be done. That would be my highest self-praise if I could do it.
Fair enough. Say whatever you like. If we go out to eastern Long Island, though, I've noticed that you've used the vocabulary of the shingle style quite successfully in a number of houses in the older villages where they rather literally follow precedent. And we're talking here about houses not dissimilar from the Martha's Vineyard house that you showed. Yet in the group of houses you did in Bridgehampton, which are really in the fields, without a pre-existing village or even suburban context, and if there's a context at all, it's former farmland and a lot of rather wretched modern houses, dropped like sort of weird, rejected sculptural objects in the field.
I didn't say any of this.
But that you don't have to. Given that, given that they are the context, is it appropriate to, even though you and I might agree that a shingle-style house is better, in quotes, are you in fact really taking your cues anymore from what's around? It's kind of, in effect, the same problem that an architect faces at much larger scale, say on 3rd Avenue. If you were asked to put a skyscraper on 3rd Avenue in New York, which is very different from being asked to build an apartment house on Park Avenue uptown, where there's a very powerful and successful context, what do you do?
Well,
You can answer. You can tell us what you do on 3rd Avenue as well as answering about Bridgehampton.
I wish I had
suppose.
an example of a slide to show you that. To go to the Bridgehampton project, which maybe some people in the audience do know, I don't agree with your analysis quite of the situation, Paul, because the context when I found it in Bridgehampton, which is in 1980 when I was hired to do that project, was still of open farmland, all destined for redevelopment.
Right.
If you go to a village like East Hampton and you go outside the absolute immediate historic core, all the land you see, the so-called summer colony, in 1900 was pasture land, or in 1895. And these architects who built there had no impulse except their own assessment of what was appropriate to build in the model of the historic village. Nonetheless, they did, and they created, with the help of landscape development, this coherent landscape that we all admire. I believe that I have created the armature for such a similar development on our 7 lots in Bridgehampton. I would also point out that around us has not actually grown up modoid
Actually,
houses.
right in your immediate vicinity is much better than down the road a little bit. That's true.
Immodestly, but then I've never been noticed otherwise. I think people have tried to pick up on what
There are a
we've
couple
done.
of houses on Ocean Avenue that are clearly proto-Stern. I mean,
That's true. Not proto, without-
neo-Stern.
Neo.
Neo-Stern, right.
I could have done them better, but such is the way.
Sternoid.
Sternoids, exactly.
We'll call it
After
sternoids.
20 years of Guathmoids, it's time for a sternoid period.
That's right.
I think that a coherent vocabulary has evolved, and I think Gwathmey and I are very much the same in the sense that we have at a certain moment, very different moment in time, but done a few things that has released impulses among a larger number of clients and their architects. And the question will remain for history to judge whether each impulse was its comparative value, if that's important, but most importantly, its comparative meanings. And but I do not accept the assessment that if I were surrounded by a whole bunch of, not Charlie Gwathmey's buildings, because I admire them, although disagree with them, but the junketecture that has
Right.
followed it, I'm not sure that I would take the job unless I could control my little patch of heaven for my client. But it usually solves itself because the person who wants the kind of environment that I can produce for them when working at my best would not want to place that
Does not want
environment
to look at
amidst something
Surfside
else.
Road in Bridgehampton. Right.
There's room for a lot of us in the world.
Yes, and you're all there. One final house-related question. It's an important one, I think, though. Your work has followed a path in the last 15 or more years toward at least relatively more literal historicism. If we think back to the Weissman House in Montauk, your first freestanding house, which is very, very interpretative.
20 years ago.
20 years, okay. Is that 65? 20 years ago. No, you were...
Just
You
when I
left
finished
Yale in
architecture.
65, right?
Well, I was always precocious, Paul.
In any case, it was highly influenced by Venturi's mother's house, and certainly not only formally influenced, but influenced by its stance of a very non-literal historicism. You've moved in stages, I think, toward a more literal historicism without ever, as you correctly point out, indulging in too much direct quotation. What's the meaning of that evolution?
Well, it's very autobiographical, but maybe this is as good a point as any to do that. I mean, I always wanted to move in the direction I have moved, but I didn't know how to do it because, not for any evil reason, I was taught to do something else, but that was what architecture was about in 1960 to 65. We learned about modernism and about the need to remake language. The Weissman House, which is a very primitive beginning work, but in which I am still in many ways proud, just by its use of shingles, just by its billboard-like facade, and of course that comes from Venturi, and its soft, rather more volumetric in the back, was a move away from Charlie Gwathmey's more direct interpretation of what he was expected to do. Charlie was doing what he was trained to do. I was trying to do something else. Those two houses are basic contemporaries.
Right.
I gather he showed the other one. I'm
Yes,
sorry. If
right.
I'd known that, I could have brought a slide of this.
Sorry.
But I think my move has been halting and sometimes inept, but always in the sense of trying to reconnect with the grander traditions. Somewhere, my epiphany came, say, in 1974 or 75, when it suddenly occurred to me that I really didn't care about modernism anymore as an issue for me. It was a historical issue, but not a preoccupation. And I wasn't going to try to redo the 20s, if I ever thought so, that they were worth redoing, but I was going to try to see if we could make a new synthesis, as I tried to explain. And since then, I think my work has grown and evolved as I and my colleagues, because a lot of people work with me on these things, have grown in skill. How to recapture all this stuff that you see, not the downlights, that's not, all this paneling and stuff, it all looks so simple. And maybe here in this particular rendition, it isn't so complicated. But there's a world of education that architects of my generation needed to know how to do that. And it's taken time.
Yeah, I think there was very much of a movement from a desire, shall we say, to comment on the shingle style, to a desire to simply do it, rather than making the comment be preeminent.
That's right.
Let me return to something I touched on a moment ago. Granted that you have not yet been lucky enough to do a skyscraper on 3rd or any other avenue, but tell us a little bit about how you might respond if you were given a major mid-Manhattan site, and you can pick 1 or 2 or 3 that you might wish to build on if you could, and just something about what kind of response you might give us.
Well, the way I would, that's so hard to answer because I think in terms of specifics. We are doing a tall building. I don't think 20 stories characterized as a skyscraper in San Diego, but it would be among the tallest.
Progress.
So that's about as high as you can go because of the airplanes there. And the problem is the same. It is a skyscraper in type, if not in literal height. And I still believe that the design of the building at the bottom, the 4 or 5 floors that are encompassed in the 30-degree vision cone that most of us have who try to move forward as we walk as opposed to go that way, is a fundamental problem that is almost, but not completely divorced from the next run of the building. Park Avenue, which you talked about before, and I did do a little townhouse on Park Avenue. I found if you did the bottom 3 floors, which is all we had, nobody ever cared about the rest in the buildings next door, and that was the issue. The richness, one thing you have to have in architecture is complexity of surface. No matter what style you want to do, you have to keep the eye busy. The eye connects to the viewer's brain just as it does to the designer's brain. And you must do that. Emphasis of big doors, little doors, the way show windows or shops can be brought into the fabric of the wall of the street and allow the shop owner then to have individuality and yet not to completely destroy the architecture. Those are critical problems, all of which were ignored in the 50s and 60s because the idea that the building would rise inexorably from bottom to top unchanged and shops wouldn't exist. Look at the shops struggling to try to survive in the Olympic Tower building. You don't even know they're there because they're hiding behind that dark brown wall.
Or the ones that never even opened at 9 West 57th Street because
they were in the basement. Right. Yes, absolutely. Those are certainly, again, the other side of it is the top of the building. And there is, at the top of any building, just at the top of any person, a very special condition. And tops talk to tops in a skyline like New York or any other city. They also can be seen at surprising vistas from surprising distances, and they demand individuality. They can represent, as they might or might, they can represent the owner or the tenant of the building, but most importantly, they have to represent the topness of buildings, and that's very important. There are rules and that you can make or break. I happen to think that Philip Johnson's new building for Hines on 53rd and 3rd is quite a nice building as a mid-rise solution in New York, yet it breaks every rule. It departs from the street front on 3rd Avenue. It steps back in funny, kind of chopped up ways, and yet it creates an essence of liveliness and articulateness that I think is successful. I don't know that I would do it that way, but all I'm trying to say is that you can't put down rules. There are contexts. Right. And next to those blank-walled buildings, a little joyous play was appropriate. 20 of those along the street, no. But 20 of anything is boring. 20 ice cream sundaes in a row would just give you a very bad belly and not much pleasure. So you have to, each building is an individual condition. That's so different from what I was taught when I went to school, which was that each building was was a type that would be reproduced, that would distill the thing and be a model for endless repetitions. And it doesn't so.
Yeah, but wait a minute. Do we really get an urbanism when each building is such a unique, condition? It seems to me as though, while yes, you can fault modernism for making a type in a way, I'm not sure the desire to make the type was the problem. It was the type itself failed so miserably at being a vernacular. It was not a good vernacular. If we go back to Upper Park Avenue in the 70s, 80s, 90s, whatever, there is a language that was repeated for block after block. It can be a little dull, but I'm not sure it isn't fundamentally more coherent urbanistically than Madison Avenue, where we go from AT&T to IBM to Trump around the corner to this down there and so forth. In the desire today to give every building as distinctive a signature, to use that phrase has now become so common, the signature building now. In the desire to make everything a signature building, I wonder if we haven't lost touch with the very concept of any kind of basic vernacular or background architecture or sort of parts that weave the fabric together.
Well, I think that, you've raised a number of issues, and I think in a part caught me a little short on the... I do believe Park Avenue is almost all right, to paraphrase Bob Venturi, and I think that the dullness, and it is a dull street, is made up for by the grandness and spaciousness of it and the detail and the architecture. As you walk along, if you are sensitive to these things, you see a variety of each building, and if you examine the top, certainly of the best buildings, say the ones at 73rd and Park on the west side, I think it's 780 and 770 and 780, marvelous tops. So that they enliven things. And they have
778.
770, 778, right. And there are wonderful things along it. But I think on the other hand, Madison Avenue, the variety that we're given at AT&T versus IBM, both of which are on Madison Avenue, illustrate perfectly the point I'm making, because AT&T does produce a kind of humanistically related massing and a street front that is porous. It creates a negative of loggia, but at least you can get in it. IBM, for all its intent on being an open and free building, you can't find your way in. The big entrance leads to a dippy little door. The great glass room really doesn't have a door at all. You sort of find it there. Sure, there's a thing to open, and it has no texture below, and it rises hundreds of floors, it seems, and a Trump Tower I will not discuss because it's not serious, and what's the point? But those two make an interesting dialogue. I think background buildings are the big problem, because a background building is something that no architect in a funny way wants to do.
Sure.
That is a problem. On the other hand, in the 20s, many architects did them with great skill, and I think that was because we supported a richer manipulation of the surface of buildings, the decorations. Eli Jacques Kahn's buildings, if you know them, like 2 Park Avenue, they're really ordinary buildings. They're barely above lofts, but they have fabulous lobbies, fabulous bottom 2 floors, and where they break and move back, and at the corners, that's where he spends his money.
What else do you need?
You'd never approve them in the Times, Paul. You know that. You'd pick on them for being unholistic. And then,
Absolutely not.
and
Absolutely
then
not.
the final point I want to pick on you is signature buildings. It drives me nuts. Raymond Hood, whom I've written about and admired, I think I was on the ground floor there, is the master of the signature building. He never did two buildings alike. And you can spot a Raymond Hood building everywhere. And they are all different in every aspect, but they're united by a certain attitude to the street. But he broke with the street wall on 40th Street for the Radiator Building. He'd never passed the urban design test. He's a tower facing a park, and yet you don't think it because of the wall. Then he does the Daily News Building on one side of 42nd and the McGraw-Hill on the other. They look like from two different planets, never mind two different architects, but they're united by certain responses to the street. I think signature buildings are wonderful. New York, and Rem Koolhaas pointed this out also, is a fabulous place for signature buildings. We need more signature buildings, but they have to write the same language, to have their personal signature within the same language.
Then I'm not sure we're really differing that much.
I know we're not, but I thought
right. I mean, I'm arguing more about the wild cacophony of different languages spoken than anything else.
Sometimes, Paul, wouldn't you agree that it's not that it's the different languages, is that a building like IBM struggles awfully hard not to speak in any language. It tries to be 40 stories of muteness.
Let me ask you this. I mean, I am no fan of the IBM building, and indeed, on this very stage, Ed Barnes and I had lively words about the IBM building 2 years ago. Nonetheless, people do seem to like it. And conversely, if I can touch on your office building in Framingham, that was the next to the last set of images you showed us, a building designed, I would gather from you, in part to rather consciously return to certain conventions of architecture that had been abandoned in the modernist suburban office building type. This building that is supposed to communicate more clearly to people is in fact responded to by a lot of people as bizarre and weird. Now, why is it that the language that doesn't seem to talk right at IBM is frequently accepted and indeed even approved of, whereas when one does speak the language, as at Framingham, the reaction is, what is this odd thing?
Well, I think that's perfectly easy to answer.
All right, answer.
First of all, and 50% of the people who've responded to Framingham hate it, and 50% of the people who like it. So that's, we solved that.
Okay.
But all of those people who've written letters and all kinds of things to me, the client, to the papers, they've looked at it and they've commented on, taken the trouble to write a letter. So that at least involves them in a conversation about the building.
Right.
IBM, it's a very nice building. Who could fault IBM? It's just very neutral.
You can fault it, in fact.
Well,
there's a lot wrong with it,
I
in fact.
want to case the world at large here. I mean, I think it's in the serious order of buildings, and that's why I will discuss it.
Sure.
But it is so neutral, it can't offend anyone in a funny way. And it comes at the end of a 60-year-old development about what buildings were about, to dematerialize structure and so forth. And so it will not get people crazy. There's no question about it. What I'm doing and what a lot of other architects are doing is going to get people crazy because it's changing the whole perception of what architecture is, particularly in the world where everybody thought it had all been worked out in the 50s, that you would make boxes in office buildings and you'd plop them around anywhere. And here I've made a building, we've made a building, that sits in this bizarre landscape. I didn't point out to the audience that the Red Roof Inn and the Mobile and the Strip is only one part of it, because the other side of the building is eyeball to eyeball with the toll plaza at Framingham Natick exit. The reason why so many people have opinions of this building is they spend a good 20 minutes every morning and 20 minutes every night staring at it. It is probably more visible than the John Hancock building in a way in downtown Boston. It has provoked them. And I'm not against
being a provocateur.
And neither is the client or the... but it is getting at the roots of saying, what does it mean to build in this place? Why are they building buildings in this place? This is a terrible place. Why do people go to those kinds of places? What do they do when they're there? I mean, you know, I guess people don't believe these places are terrible in the audience, or I've confirmed their feelings, but it's not an idyllic suburban landscape, nor is it a bustling downtown landscape. It's a purely expedient location, and I tried to make something more dignified and have a little fun.
Okay. Let me turn to some of your questions, since a number of them are quite lively. I'll begin with one that fits into that category. If you were the client, who, other than yourself, would you commission to build a new museum in New York?
If the only way I could answer that is I have been to almost all the recent museums built in America and in Europe. Let's say the wave of the last 5 or 6 years in which there's been a tremendous burst of museum building. And the only one of them that has, as they say, knocked my socks off and stuck to the ribs at the same time is Sterling's building in Stuttgart, which is a work of considerable meaning, toughness, and satisfying quality as architecture. Not to give Jim Sterling too much, his building at Harvard is horrible and a total disappointment to me, particularly the outside. But Stuttgart is a great building. So maybe the answer to it is, aside from, not to be facetious, is that you need more than just a good architect. You need a good client, and you need the right circumstances, the setting, the whole thing together. Architects are only as good as the clients they get.
I think this audience is particularly sensitive to your role as a writer and historian and commentator on architecture, as well as an architect yourself, because I'm going to go on to a somewhat related question. Which commission did you not get that you wish you had gotten? And what would you have done? Perhaps a museum edition. or a particular skyscraper. And how do you assess the work done by the architect who did get the job?
Well, I wasn't interviewed for either the Guggenheim or the Whitney. I wouldn't have the Guggenheim Commission for all the tea in China. It's an impossibility, in my opinion. And that's all I could say. The Whitney Museum is a very interesting project. And for whatever it's worth, as my thesis project in architecture school, I did the original building before I was able to see the design. So I've had a lifelong...
Before the Breuer building.
The Breuer building. Professional interest. And as a teacher, I have given the earlier version of the program that Graves finally designed to as a student project, a studio project at Columbia. So I have many opinions, but those were all I will give at the platform.
Okay.
I don't know what buildings. I mean, that's so, you know, they also ran the ones you didn't get. I mean, it's a competition, and you get buildings that you want. I don't have any. I have regrets, but that's why I wish my Roosevelt Island project were built, simply because I think it was it represented a major step forward in the realm of mass housing, which has never been taken really by anyone because there has been so little large-scale housing construction since that time. It was the mid-'70s, and the whole idea of building large-scale projects was repudiated, probably correctly in terms of rebuilding old parts of cities, but on an island like Roosevelt Island, where there was nothing and still has been nothing built there, I think we could have made a major contribution. So if in the area of regrets, that's the one I have.
That actually is a kind of nice lead into the question that I wanted to give you next, which is, please comment on the state of architecture for the common person. We talk about the influence of Mies and Breuer on our lives, that is, our working lives. What about the effects of the ranch, splanch, split, and cape on our domestic lives? Do you have any plans to work with builders involved in middle-class housing to raise their design standards?
Yes, no, and I'll explain. The first thing I want to explain is before I set up my own shingle as an architect, I worked for a number of years for the Housing and Development Administration in the era of John Lindsay's mayorship, and it was a very interesting learning experience. And in particular, I benefited from working with a man named Samuel Rutensky, who had graduated from Penn in around 1930, had gone as one of the first people to go to Taliesin when Frank Lloyd Wright opened the fellowship. You can read some interesting correspondence with between Rutensky and Wright in that book on letters, and then became a professional houser in the 30s and 40s when it was the most idealistic thing that architects could do. And Sam Rutensky taught me one thing among many. He said, you know, Bob, if you want an idea accepted in America about a new way for people to do something in architecture, never do it for the poor first. They will never accept it, and everyone will tell you you can't do it. If you can get the rich to do it, then everybody else will want it. And I've taken that very, very seriously, because we watched, for example, how housing collapsed, but if you could build a very expensive super project as Davis Brody's is over here on 3rd Avenue, it was all right. If you propose that for low-income families, I may not be all right, but assuming it is, that 40-story building just a block or two away, you get pickets from here to City Hall and back. Once you change it, maybe it gets better. In any case, I think Rutensky was speaking from the heart and from the head at the same time. I did in 1976 and subsequently on my own tack projects for the South Bronx, which I published.
The subway suburb.
For the subway suburb, to try to show how the area which is being redeveloped as Charlotte Gardens could be developed for low-income families along suburban lines. I believe the suburb is the absolute cracking point of integration at every level in our society. It is the last bastion, if not of purely white people anymore, of gentrified people or people who fancy themselves as gentrified. And I did drawings, and I worked with students, I did drawings in the office, and we published them. But you know, I'm sure all of you have been to Charlotte Gardens in the South Bronx to realize that a suburb is being built there. Ed Logue has had prefabricated houses trailered in from Pennsylvania and Indiana. They are splanchburgers of major proportions. They sit on something like quarter-acre lots behind white picket fences, and wait until you see them on television. And they are a parody, because who in anybody in mad world would put a quarter-acre lot 15 minutes from Times Square? Nobody could afford it, really. Mr. Rockefeller couldn't live that way. Besides that, how can you sustain a kind of an urban world with that kind of low level development so near to it? So having proposed my idea, nobody paid any attention among the people to whom it was directed and to whom I would go to the mat to say it could have benefited and been meaningful. The people who have hired me are the people who built Mecox Field in Bridgehampton and many other developers who, for affluent people, realize that you can build a coherent community of relatively small houses that have something to do with each other and make a place. And so I get to build my subway suburb in a slightly augmented form for, well, I won't say rich people, but people who have discretionary cash at their disposal. People who can afford to pay to go to lectures, like you and everyone. Let's be honest about this. And perhaps if it's published in the pages of a magazine and people go to Bridgehampton to do it, or to New Jersey suburbs and so forth, then maybe our planners will think it's good enough for poor people. Who knows? You never know.
I think you've already answered the very next question here, which is, do you have any ethical qualms about designing pleasure palaces for the rich?
No.
Okay.
I have no ethical qualms about designing for anyone whose ethics I have no trouble with. If I was interested in morality, I would have become a priest, I suppose, a rabbi, but since I'm not fabulously interested in that, except that I like to work for people who are nice people, who want to get the best out of me, and who want what I have to offer. And that's the ultimate ethic. I do not, just as I don't know whether you're all cutthroats or honest men and women, I cannot look into my clients' souls, but this is a capitalist society. It's been pretty good to me, and I enjoy it. That does not mean, and I want to be very clear because sometimes I can be a little cavalier, I realize. I'm very sincere, and any sincere opportunity that would come my way, and I welcome it, to do something for people who cannot do it for themselves, I will do. I find the problem is the do-gooders in between the people you want to help and the people who can help, the people who have ideas, that gray world in between, who are always the people who say, no, you can't do it. I never deal on that basis. And I sat on both sides of the desk. I worked in housing. I realized I know them from the inside. And so it's a tough question, but I am not embarrassed about working for the rich clients. They help me. I'm the Robin Hood of architects, if you like.
I'm going to follow that one bit further with this question. What is the range of cost to owners of houses you've completed in the last 5 years? And how much should one expect to pay per square foot for a house you would design today for property in the northeastern United States?
Could someone want to see me out in the hall later? Architecture, look, building buildings is very expensive, no matter for whom you're building them. In our society, it is incredibly expensive to build buildings. To build them well is very much more expensive. To achieve the kind of work you've seen, whether the presence of detail visually shown, as I did, or Charlie Gwathmey's absence of detail, which is just as expensive to achieve those effects, it's like Morgan said, if you have to ask the cost of running the yacht, you can't afford it. It is expensive. Building is expensive. And well building is very expensive. So, I mean, there's not, nothing we can say. That's all.
There's a small footnote to this question. How many square feet is the house on Oyster Bay? That's a number you're permitted to reveal, isn't it? Even if you...
About 6,000 or 6,500 square feet. I don't remember exactly in that area.
Here's one on which you will surely be more forthcoming. Tell us about Pride of Place.
Be delighted, but that will take hours. Pride of Place is a personal view of American architecture. I was invited to prepare the concept, to then develop it. So good or bad, and insofar as the ideas are given, it will be me to blame. It is being done with Malone Gill are the producers for Mobile. They did Civilization and the Ascent of Man, and Alistair Cook's America, and other distinguished, and we hope ours will be equally distinguished, presentations of ideas to a wide audience. It is a direct extension of my belief that American architecture is not a unique expression in the sense of you cannot find an American style that is as distinct as English style. If you could say you could find a distinct English style, but in fact, if you examine that, you can't. But there are American qualities, the need to reinvent a past and to invent a past, which we have had as a country made up of totally of foreigners who one day found themselves to become citizens of the United States. The need to build a whole new kind of city, a whole new kind of environment, college campuses, office buildings, and 100 other things that didn't exist before, and to make them, and the way we've done it is to make them like things before. Cathedrals of commerce, whole campuses that look like English universities, but are made of steel and glass, as Yale is, and so forth. It's an attempt to single out for praise and introduce in the first person, as many as possible, architects and their clients who have a drive to do something special and different, who take a pride in a place. And it's an irreverent, in the sense of unorthodox view of all kinds of places. We roam from Mount Vernon and Monticello, which are, you say, oh God, if I have to see those again, I'm going to scream, but I think we'll show them to you in ways that will be surprising, because our programs also deal with Disneyland, shopping centers like the Galleria in Houston, where Paul appears in it. A little plug, you have to watch these things.
I was asked to choose my very favorite building in America and appear in that segment.
All the places the people are in are of my choosing, as a rule, almost exclusively. So it goes all over the map. I hope it will make Americans as proud as I am of what we've done. I do not believe that it's appropriate to go around and saying American architecture is inferior to Europe. It's not inferior, it's different from Europe's architecture. It draws on it and it makes its own. It's not to say it's a Pollyanna view of America, because we go to Charlotte Gardens in the South Bronx, where I have a long conversation with Gwendolyn Wright, who is a serious critic of suburban housing and can answer some of those questions better than I that were raised. And we look at the suburb as a type and as evolution. So it's about things I'm interested in. To answer in a short sentence, it's about what American architecture is, and it's about conditions like the campus, the skyscraper, the suburb, the dream house, the interior room, and the garden and the grid, which form our American cities, which are things I have been studying as an architect and historian, and therefore can talk with a certain amount of conviction, if not exactly knowledge.
When will it be broadcast?
It should be broadcast approximately March 24th at 8 o'clock, but we don't have that finally confirmed. It is 8 parts. Check your local bus shelter. You'll see a poster, I'm sure.
I sort of feel like this moment, having never had quite this experience, like sort of Johnny Carson is supposed to say, now you open at the Tropicana in Las Vegas next week or whatever. I mean,
we'd like to open at the White House, thank you.
Okay. I'm going to go back to architecture. Your architecture seems to work best when depth of materials is allowed to animate your historical references. In your curtain wall office building, you did not have the luxury of this depth, and the historical reference is thin, like a cartoon or a roadside sign. Is this the appropriate response in this age of thin curtain-walled buildings?
It's an appropriate response, and the cartoon-like, roadside sign-like quality of that building, I think, is an appropriate response to its concept. If you put the Parthenon on that site, fully modeled in Pentelic marble, I think it would look ridiculous there. It would be out of context and in demeaning to the building. I had hoped, I do believe, we have established a meaningful dialogue between something that approximates the dignity of the Parthenon in the form of a fully modeled, articulated portico and the thinness of the glass wall. It is lighthearted, jokey, and part of that environment. You cannot see it. The only slide that really tells the full story is the slide which brings in all the context. But the only way to see buildings, any building, is to go to the building and look all the way around. The camera is a liar. It only shows you a focused view, which you would not, if you stood just where the camera was, you'd see 10 times more with your own eyes.
Good, thank you. Can you explain how architecture has evolved so quickly within so few years, from the stark less is more to the style that you and Michael Graves have made the new architecture?
It hasn't been so slow. I don't know when Mies said that improbably weird thing, less is more, but Bob Venturi said less is a bore. Well, he published it in 1966. I heard him say it in 62. So, I mean, my Lord, the Renaissance lasted only 50 years, and we're 25 years from less is a bore. So I hardly think we've whipped into it. I just wonder why it took so long, frankly. And even within modernism, Paul Rudolph, who was my great teacher in terms of design, was struggling against Mies and criticizing Mies. He got up in front of the AIA in '63 and was, of course, hooted down by his colleagues, criticizing Mies as being a kind of one-line architect, an obsessive about one
You made
idea.
that wonderful remark that Mies makes such great architecture because he ignores so much of what architecture is.
Exactly the line. I'd forgotten it. Thank you. And that was in '63 in Miami, and I was there, in fact. And Alto was given the gold medal at that very meeting of the AIA. And if you examine Alto's architecture, it has many things about modernism in it and its reduction, but less is more is not part of it. It's rich and additive. I think our whole take on the 20th century is completely horse-blindered. Mies had a tremendous impact, and he's one of my favorite architects, and I admire him extraordinarily because what he set out to do, he did fabulously. But the whole of modern architecture in the 20th century is not about emptying out, it's about reduction. Reduction means going on a diet, but you still have shape. In fact, you have more shape in a way when you go on a diet. Emptying out was the way people interpreted less is more. And so I don't think that we're so far apart. I see myself, and I see Michael Graves, much more part of a continuity than not part of a continuity.
Good, thank you. I think we have time for one more. It's an intriguing one. I like your work and see it as stylized. And the questioner notes in parentheses, I am not an architect. Does my comment insult you or compliment your effort? Is it style or more enduring?
Both and, to quote. Of course, it's about style. I think style is the thing that we ultimately can focus on if you accept what I tried to say toward the beginning of this conversation or discussion, that you have to assume that behind style there is order, discipline, logic, integrity, everything that makes a building into a work of architecture. But the final thing is how you present yourself to the world. You could take 10 buildings and make them all different and have the same plan and section by manipulating the expression. It's a little bit about fashion. There is nothing wrong about fashion because we're all alive. Fashion is one of the ways we express our sense. It's perfectly easy to go to the Whitney Museum and look at Charles Eames, who denied furiously that he was about style, and you can go there and say that everybody says, oh, how 50s, as though oh, how 50s actually meant anything. All it means is that was the style that in the 50s more people admired than any other style who thought they were with it. Because you know that your mother didn't have Charles Eames furniture, and neither did mine back then. So, sure, and we focus on style, and I always focus on style because it gets everybody crazy, because it's what I'm most passionate about. That's where the thing begins, how it looks. But it's not where, that's where it ends, rather, but it's not where it begins. It begins with sitting down and working it all out, figuring out how to get as much for the money and all those things. But to sit and talk about that, well, we might as well have a conference of sewer contractors. It would be uninteresting. I'd be bored in any case.
Why is style so interesting, do you think?
Style is the difference between you're wearing a blue striped suit and a yellow tie, the yuppie tie of the spring, I was told, with little dots. And my wearing this tie with these funny things.
I've had it for years.
Which when my father had a tie like this, I said, and of course it was about that wide, I said, how could you wear such a tie? Now I find it's this wide and it's all new and it's by, what the hell was that guy's name? Armani, and it's style. I don't know what it means. You just know it. And I suppose you hire an architect like you hire a fashion designer or whatever. Painters go in and out of style. Poets go in and out of style. Novelists go in and out of style. Henry James, a great writer, for a generation nobody could read him. Now people read Henry James. They make television documentaries on him. He's back in style. How many of you read James Joyce anymore? When I was in college, if you didn't read James Joyce and if you couldn't recite T.S. Eliot morning, noon, and night, you were considered a fool. I've never heard anybody say anything about James Joyce in 15 years. It doesn't make Joyce less or more. It moves. And who can define it? You never can define it. You can only sense it, be part of it, enjoy it, and let the next generation assess it. To be out of style, well, I don't enjoy that. I like to be in style. To run with the fashions, on the other hand, is not my style either. So I don't know. Can't answer that. Just take each building as it comes along.
Okay. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Bob Stern. Thank you. Thank you again. A quick reminder to everyone here, Frank Gehry of California will be next week's guest. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.